Well, let me just start by saying that I came here at the age of 23 years old. I was hired as what was the third director of the Lyme Historical Society, Florence Griswold House. Wasn't really calling itself a museum at the time. And I came here from the San Francisco Bay Area, but I really came from Cooperstown, New York, where I was in graduate school in museum training at the Cooperstown Graduate Program. And I had never been to Connecticut prior to coming here for an interview. I interviewed with Dan Woodhead, who was then the president of the society, and was hired. I went back to California to gather up some of my belongings, and it was when I came down for breakfast in Redwood City, California, where I was raised. There was a cover article on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle about this little-known, unknown disease that had been discovered in Lyme, Connecticut. And, you know, if you know me, I kind of freaked out, kind of panicked about it. I called my predecessor, Ann Smith, and said, now I see why they've hired me. You know, it's like no one wanted this job, and that wasn't quite true. But she calmed me down, and I came. As I said, I was a very young man. The organization was a very small organization. The annual operating budget was $36,000 a year. I was the only employee, so I had to do basically everything. And my starting salary was $8,600, which was even underpaid for that era for the kind of work that I was doing. But I was a zealot. That did not matter. I saw this place. I saw the potential of it. And I believed that I could do something here and I say a zealot in the sense that I was a true believer in the power of history and art to change lives. I had a passion for museums, for taking places and trying to make things happen. And, you know, I have never thought of myself as a particularly talented person, but there is one talent that I do have, and that is I can help people to achieve things that they would not even think was possible for themselves. And even further to that, I can help organizations to, thrive in ways. And, how can I do that? It's really about people, about relationships. And I was thrown into a community where I knew no one. It seemed to me like there was no young people living in the community. This was 1976, right in the very end of the American bicentennial celebration. But there was a lot of interest in history and the American past. And the museum had really the stage was set for me to, continue to professionalize the operation. Margaret Brown had been president for 4 years, from 1968 to 1972. We never worked together, but her legacy was one that I think it's fair to say, acted on in terms of what she saw as the potential of the Florence Griswold House. Not having other staff, I relied really entirely on volunteers. And there was a esprit de corps as we looked at cataloging the collections, thinking about what we could do to get the museum more involved in the community. And I began an exhibition program that looked at the retrospective exhibitions of various artists. I started with Greg Smith and worked with Anne, and especially Greg Smith, his son, whom you know very well. And I began these series of exhibitions. We'd have openings, we'd publish catalogs, and that's when I first got to know you. You were living in Boston, and I asked you to do a banner for one of the shows. We can't quite figure out which banner, but you did a spectacular job, and that was an innovation back then to announce to the community that a new exhibition was starting. And so we grew the exhibition program, but it was, life is often about timing. And the timing of when I came was a particularly good time in a way because of the interest that was rising in American Impressionism, in American art, American cultural history. And so I really began to delve into that. I got to know many of the families of the Lyme artists, and I went to them with like a missionary in a way, and said, look, we're going to devote this museum to the story of the Lyme artists and the history of the community, how they impacted the history of Old Lyme, and we're going to do this more in depth than any other museum in America. Your ancestor, your father or grandfather or grandmother or mother's artwork has a role to play in the museum. And it was I think a fair to say, somewhat persuasive perspective. And so, because the collection was very embryonic, it was not really. It had largely relied upon borrowing collections from families, including the Ely family were very involved in the early years of the Griswold House. And so we began to work in this way. And it was about 1978 that I went to the board and I said, we need to start calling our institution the Florence Griswold Museum. And its incorporated name was Lyme Historical Society, but the museum was the sort of public face, public forward, and and I felt that it had I saw my vision for the Florence Griswold Museum was a place that would be deeply rooted in the community, but speak to the nation about its role that it played in American cultural history. And what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is the dining room. Let's start with the dining room. The dining room is, and I believe this with all of my heart, it's one of the greatest rooms in America. And I believe that it needed to have its context to show what, it was an experiment in communal living. And my training in graduate school was really about public history, social history, history for the people. And I was a believer that if we told stories, those stories would animate the visitor experience and make people want to be a part of the organization. And so, but the key all along were volunteers. And we had volunteer docents, we had volunteer folks that helped us in the curatorial area, educators, and that to some degree exists still to this day. The volunteer ethic is one of the great things about American society. It's something your organization has in abundance, and we all rely on volunteers. And I'm a kind of person that if as director, I got involved in their lives. I got to know them, know their families, and they would do anything to further the institution. And so, we had the volunteers were a big key to the growth and development of the institution. The other thing that I would say that was key was the Board of Trustees. And, a Board of Trustees is a really important part of any kind of organizational development. And again, it was, we didn't hardly have any money. And so Margaret Brown had this concept of boards of trustees should be made up of three parts. One part is deeply rooted folks in the community, volunteers or grassroots folks in the community. 1/3 should be those that are who have philanthropy, the ability to be philanthropists, and 1/3 academics that actually know the content of what your institution is about. And so we carried that out. We believed that, and that's how we grew and developed the board with people like Nancy Kriebel whose family name is on the Kriebel Gallery. That's a good example of someone who was very self-effacing, but wanted to do good with the resources that she had and was very generous and so forth. And, anyway, but those early years, I was terribly lonely, I think it's fair to say. I lived up on Honey Hill Lane in Lyme, and in a garage apartment that had electric heat. The first winter, I could not afford to pay for my electric heat. I had no money. And so I went to the board chair, Dan Woodhead, and said, I know that my predecessor actually lived in the Griswold House. Would it be okay if I did? Oh, sure, Jeff, that would be fine. And so I moved in, and so literally I'd sleep in the back wing. I'd put on my slippers in the morning and walk 4 feet across the hallway to my office. And so I basically worked all the time. I had other interests. I had had somewhat of a social life, but not too much. And, but my interests were really a typical young man's interest. I was intensely interested in rock and roll music. And I had to be sure to remember not to play the music in my apartment when the museum was open or the house was open on Saturday and Sunday. And, at the time, a week, if we had any visitors on a particular day, that was considered a good day. And so we had less than 1,000 visitors the first year that I was there. And so it was it felt a little bit like a startup, if you will, and how to get people interested in coming there and changing the exhibits and having programs and so forth. So, it was a process, but I ended up moving into the house, and I just loved it. I mean, this creaky old Griswold house was just something. And eventually I met some young people. Will and Dietzy Bradford was, I think, the first young couple I met, and I got them involved in the organization. Will eventually became president of the board, and Dietzy was very involved as a volunteer and so forth. So, but Old Lyme was an incredible place back then. It was when the Gazette was publishing, Alva Gahagan and Dave Holohan and others. They were just starting up this community newspaper, and I learned so much from that about various old timers, and we had an oral history program as well. I interviewed a lot of people, got to know a lot of people, and just loved every minute of it.
So did you, when do you think the real change became? Was it when you built the new building or added on?
Way before that.
Way before that, okay.
I would go back to 1980 when we were invited by the William Benton Museum at the University of Connecticut at Storrs to do a show with them on Connecticut and American Impressionism. And it was a 3-part type show, all at the same time in the spring of 1980. And I curated a show on the art colony of Old Lyme. The Hurlbut Gallery in Greenwich did the Cos Cob art colony, and then the Benton Museum did the overview about and so it was a show of, I think, something like between the 3 institutions, a couple hundred works of art from museums all over the country, private collections, and that got a lot of national press. We published a book in connection with it. And so that was really the beginning of a sort of outward facing beyond the community, but always trying to stay grounded in the community, but attracting visitors to the institution. That set us on a program of doing temporary exhibitions and catalogs that were, we would borrow from the Met, or we borrow from the Smithsonian American Art Museum in DC. And, we would try to get publicity. We hired our first curator. We actually hired our first employee who still lives there, Teresa Coos, who still works there, I should say, Teresa Coos, who grew up in town. She was an outstanding business student at Old Lyme High School, and we hired her right from the high school as our secretary for the organization, and bought her an IBM Selectric typewriter. Remember those?
Yeah, yeah.
And she worked there. And then in 1978, we hired our first curator, Bonnie McAdam. And Bonnie was here for about 4 or 5 years. And, you know, the bringing on of curators and eventually educators and broadening the staff was really key to the development of the organization. You know, the trustee leaders that I worked with started with Dan Woodhead, then George Tatum, who was an academic art historian who lived on Academy Lane. That was followed by George Willauer, who is to this day a very good friend. And Joan Sillen followed, I think it was Joan that followed George. And Joan was, she had this expression, Jeff, we need to buy back the farm. And what she meant by that is that the property of Florence Griswold had been sold, as you know. I mean, that's a whole long story, which I won't get into, but you know, a conservator was assigned to handle her Florence Griswold's affair very late in her life. She was considerably in debt, and the conservator basically said the only way you're going to get out from under is to sell the house and property. And so even the Griswold house was sold privately. This is not really very much known today. It's utterly remarkable. Let me say, it's a miracle that those painted panels on the doors and walls still exist, that they were never sold, never distributed, because the house was in private hands for about 5 years. And, you know, a family, the Marsh family, purchased the property, built the Marsh Field behind the Griswold house, eventually sold the Griswold house and just a postage stamp piece of property to the Florence Griswold Association. That's what the organization was first known as. And then in the 1950s, with Joseph Dunn at the library, the Lyme Historical Society was formed and conjoined with what was called the Lyme Historical Society Florence Griswold Association. And then eventually the Florence Griswold Association was subsumed into the Lyme Historical Society. And, you know, that it continued to exist, and it still exists today, but only as a program, the archives, the Lyme Historical Society archives, which is I think, an excellent complement to the programs of the Old Lyme Historical Society. So the 1980s were a time where we were trying to, and then to acquire property. We were unsuccessful when Marshfield came up on the land. Came up on the market, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is the future of the museum is going to be circumcised by this. But we bought the Saunders property, where not the garage, but the house. And we began to acquire in about 9 different property transactions, little pieces that had all been carved up and divided. And we started to bring it back together. And we began to think about a new kind of Florence Griswold Museum, one that would unite the setting with the collection and the story. And that was a kind of triumvirate a very powerful triumvirate of where the visitor could have a immersive experience learning about the history of Old Lyme and the story of what took place on that property, of artists that came and stayed there and so forth. And so, that, and eventually in the mid-1990s, thanks to Wilson Wild, who was the Hartford Steam Boiler CEO in Hartford, he helped us it was the John Rowland administration. We remember him, and he was a Republican governor, but he believed in the arts and he believed in the future of the Florence Griswold Museum. And he the Bond Commission, the state gave us a large, about I think it was just over $2 million to purchase Marshfield and about 5 acres of property. And that set us on a stage to begin to build the Kriebel Gallery and go from there. But before we built the Kriebel Gallery, I said to our organization and our staff, we have to do historical archaeology. We have to, before we're going to disturb any of this landscape, we have to know what took place here. And I reached out to Harold Julie, who was the professor of anthropology and an archaeologist at Connecticut College. And we did a 2-year project. It's really, to my knowledge, the only known historical archaeological project to look at an American art colony. And so we unearthed something like 20,000 artifacts. It was, and we were looking for trash pits. We were looking for the dimensions of one of the barns that was converted into studios. We found that. We actually found the foundation stones of that. We were also looking at the garden because we didn't own the garden, the original garden. We were looking at, what was the circumference of the garden, and we found that, and a lot more. And we also found the site of the so-called Child Hassam studio. And one day I was in my office and I got a call about coming out to see what they were doing that day. And they had been digging down considerably within the studio outer walls, and they found a completely intact metal paint box that had been left there. It was just remarkable. And I said, "Come on, you guys, you're punking me. I know you are. There's no way that this is that you actually found this here. You've just seeded this here to get me all excited." They said, "No, Jeff, we actually found it." And so we did that. And then the first building we built was what was called the Hartman Education Center in 1999. And that was right in the center of the campus, of the site. And there was something symbolic about education being the centrality of, our mission. I mean, it's really all about ultimately education, about exciting young people in art and history and material culture. So those were the turning points. But I think getting that riverfront property was and unifying it with, if you will, the Griswold story and the collections was key.
So I know that Sheila Wertheimer, who used to be a board member here and worked on our gardens.
I didn't know that.
I used to volunteer in as a part of the garden gang, which I loved doing, and it was a wonderful group of ladies. And you would often come out and see what was going on.
Yeah.
So Sheila spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was the original garden about, and was that part of that whole archaeological part, or?
Well, it was. It was in tandem with the archaeology, and I asked her, commissioned her. I mean, she had studied. She was a historical garden historian. She had studied with Rudy Favretti at UConn, and I asked her. I said, Sheila, I need you to dig into the archives and really and write up a report about the garden, its history, going back to when it was first established in the 1850s, and taking it up through that, and so that if we're going to restore the garden, recreate the garden, it needs to be based on historical precedents. And she did a wonderful job on that, and was just completely passionate, absorbed in that. But I had worked with her before that when we didn't have that property. She was helping us to do the Brevelier Garden, which was named in honor of Bunny Brevelier, who was an early volunteer that was very involved in the museum, and that was over by the Huntley Brown House. But it was a sort of almost like a facsimile, just to evoke the feeling of what was once here. But it wasn't on the actual property where the garden was. So I think it sent mixed messages. It was kind of confusing. A smaller version of that garden still exists as a kind of entrance garden to the museum today.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of the most wonderful things about the museum is just walking around on the grounds.
Exactly.
And so I think also, you were there for what,
41 years.
41 years, okay. And it must have been quite a change to decide to step down from that.
Well, I was there for really the entirety of my career, and one of the trustees, David Dongermont, you probably know David. David told me once, Jeff, you've actually run 3 different museums, at least 3 different museums. You've just stayed in the same place to do that. And what he meant by that is that the museum, we had to reinvent ourselves at different points of the way when we had opportunities and challenges. We failed in some instances where things didn't work out the way you hoped it would. I had ideas that didn't find fruition. I wanted the museum to acquire the Roger Torrey Peterson property and studio. I thought that could be a wonderful annex to our operation. The board didn't ultimately feel that was a good, and I had to respect that as director, and I did. But I had opportunities certainly to go to other institutions, but I stayed there, and I've often sort of thought about this. Why did I stay there for so long? And I think it was the people and the sense that we hadn't really fully told the story, and I was very committed to the idea of trying to acquire the entirety of the property. And ultimately in 2016, this is the so-called Hannes property, Warren Hannes, who was a friend, had his business there, and it was about 1.5 acres of riverfront property, actually just over 2 acres. And it was kind of the gap in the the gap in the smile of the that's a bad simile, but anyway, it was something that was really that we needed to acquire, and eventually we were able to acquire that, and that got me thinking that now it's time for others to lead this organization and so forth. And
well, we were really lucky to have that consistency that you brought to it too, because that starting with a vision at 24 and going for 41 years is quite an amazing
I was just so lucky to work with all of these amazing people that have chosen Lyme and Old Lyme to live in. And I mean, this community is so blessed by people that have accomplished things in other areas, but they're drawn back. Maybe they grew up here, but maybe they have family here. They're drawn back to this place, to its kind of special mix of nature, history, and art, and I would say intellectual stimulation. And I felt that strongly. I feel very lucky. I worked hard. But it was such a privilege, really, to do it. And do you remember Harry Sedgwick? Harry gave me what I thought was it really kind of took my breath away. He complimented me in a way that I'm not sure I'm worthy of it, but the thing he told me one day, he said, Jeff, you run that museum with a lightness of touch. And I just love that. I don't think it's really true, but I love the thought behind it. And, and what he meant by that was that, it was never about me. It was about the institution. And I love to put others in a position of where the light could shine on them, whether it's a volunteer, a board member, a staff member. And the talent there is incredible. I mean, I love, since I've left, what's going on there now. I think, and I think one of the best shows the museum has done, I had nothing to do with, but I hope you saw that New England County quilts and bed covers.
Amazing.
That was an amazing exhibition, and I'm so proud of our curators, our directors, and that they supported and put together at that exhibition based on the material culture of Lyme and Old Lyme and the southeastern Connecticut. And, you know, I think history is all around us. And one of the philosophies that I had about the Florence Griswold Museum was, because people say it's an art museum, and I agree with that, and I promoted it as that, but I would argue it's a cultural history museum, in my view. It's a place that contextualizes art. And, you know, even going back to those early exhibitions when we did retrospectives, I was always interested in the contextual understanding and so forth. And I think that's where, you know, the museum and the Old Lyme Historical Society, how to put this, you know, what took place here in context, how to put the past in a broader context. And so, you know, that's just a, you know, that was my perspective.
So how much, there was quite a lot of changes on the property as you got more and more. Did you run into any issues with people, you know, the whole zoning question and all that part of the town sort of saying no or yes, or was it pretty easy to get through and put in a store and the restaurant?
I mean, we had to present plans.
Yeah.
I think you're probably talking about the Kriebel Gallery and the development of that. I mean, there was certainly resistance on the part of certain community members that felt that a modern building was not appropriate in this historic site. You know, I applaud our Board of Trustees for not succumbing to that or to thinking that we needed to do a neo-historical, but in a way, all architecture is neo-historical. It's not even modern architecture has its antecedents and so forth. And you know, the opportunity to build a gallery was one of the things that I was most excited about in my career, and certainly when that became on the horizon as a possibility, because always we were concerned about the Griswold House being a wood frame building. And, you know, we wanted, and also being not as accessible as it, as a more modern building. And so the motivation was to build a gallery and collection storage and archival storage facility that would be a place for, you know, for the 21st century and beyond. And so when we went to the town committees and presented that, it was in that context. And also it gave us then the opportunity to turn the Griswold House into its highest and best use, in our opinion, which was to tell the kind of social history of an American communal living experiment, social history of those that worked for Florence Griswold, her family, and of the artists. So the shop was a part of it. It was a pretty modest shop. There wasn't really, you know, it was thought of as, you know, inconsistent. And I think the one thing that we always tried to do in all of our projects was to be understated in the thrust of it. And from a design standpoint, its design is basically takes its DNA from the tobacco barns of Connecticut. You know, big, large barn-like forms. Chad Floyd, a brilliant architect at Centerbrook, one of the partners, I worked very closely with him. We developed an enduring friendship from that. I pushed back. I was a tough client, it's fair to say. There were certain things that I held true of what I wanted, but I was open-minded to all of his ideas too. But I found the town to be very supportive of the idea of the expansion plan.
Yeah, it seems like you know, there's other institutions now that have sort of grown out of the whole idea of the Florence Griswold House, including the Lyme Art Association and then the Art Academy. And I know that, and even the Roger Torrey Peterson was, you know, there's wishes to try and make a little bit more ways of making money for their institutions, and it's certainly reasonable. And I think the precedent that was set at the Flo Grizz was certainly a good piece to
Well,
opening that door.
absolutely. And I mean, these nonprofits do need to thrive. They need to have, some of them have business entities, but it's all got to be done in the context of Old Lyme and
Yes.
what the community's comfortable with. I had to learn patience coming here, and I know you've had to learn that too. And I've had to learn patience. That was probably the thing that was most difficult for me. And sometimes you're ahead of where your board is, where the organization is, and sometimes you have to slow down and be patient and come around to different ways. It's all a grand experiment.
Yes.
I will say one thing I wanted to emphasize that made a huge difference and really charted the future course of the museum was when we were building the gallery, we were given a collection, an extraordinary collection, the Hartford Steam Boiler Fine Arts Collection. This would be 2001. The company, Hartford Steam Boiler, one of the great Connecticut companies going back to the 19th century, one of the first public safety companies, an insurance company that not only insures boilers, but actually inspects them so they don't blow up. I mean, it's just a phenomenal concept as a company, very successful. I helped them with another museum director to build a phenomenal collection about the art of Connecticut. American artists from the 18th century to the 20th century, everyone from Thomas Cole to Milton Avery, for whom Connecticut was an important part of their artistic life and personal life. We built the collection over a 12 or so year period. The company was a possible takeover, hostile takeover bid, or maybe friendly takeover bid. And the board of trustees, board of directors of the company decided we need to keep this collection in Connecticut. And I received a letter from Richard Booth, the president of the company. It was a one-sentence letter. Dear Jeff, I want to invite you to lunch for a topic that will be of future interest to the museum. And I knew what it was about, and I prepared, like you wouldn't believe, to argue why it should come to the Florence Griswold Museum and not say the Wadsworth Athenaeum or the New Britain Museum. Both institutions I love, but I didn't even have to do that. That had already been decided if we were willing to accept it. And so I flew back. I don't know how I drove back. I was so elated at what this meant. But I also realized the building we were building was too small. Wow. And the future was now. So I went to then president of the board, Tony Thurston, a great man. And I said, Tony, we have this opportunity, but we're going to have to do a giant change order. And we had planned for a future expansion down the road, but the future was now. And the board supported it. We raised money. We extended the campaign to about $16.5 million to do what we needed to do. But it set a course for what the museum is engaged in and has been engaged in the last 20 years or so, showcasing art of the 20th century. They're about to open a Leo Jensen show, a pop artist. I wouldn't have ever done that back in the day when, with just the Griswold House. And so Anna Odette was the last show. The museum today is akin to the Farnsworth Museum in Rockland, Maine, which collects around the art of Maine. I'm hoping the Florence Griswold Museum, and they are doing it, and I hope they'll continue to really collect the art of Connecticut, as well as, of course, embracing the community ties and the community history through the archives especially.
This is great. One last question, which you mentioned to me something about your historic ties to Old Lyme from your own family, and I just love it.
This is I've gotten interested in genealogy since being retired, and my friend and former colleague Cheryl Poirier has helped me with some genealogical research. I know she's giving a program here next month, but I shared our family tree. She started digging into it. We got together, and I have family that goes back to the 1850s in California, in Northern California, Sonoma County. But the DNA that I sent into Ancestry showed that way more than I ever believed or thought, I have a lot of English ancestry from East Anglia, which is, of course, where the Puritans emigrated from and came to America. Well, it turns out many of them came to Massachusetts and then moved eventually to Connecticut. It turns out that I have a ancestor, and a direct ancestor, 7th generations going back, a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather that was born in 1738 in New London County. Okay. Where was he born in New London County? He was born in Lyme. And his name was James Giddings, and I am intimately related to a lot of the local families here. I never knew this. I'm related to the Colt family, to the Brockway family, and so it's just one of those delights of, here I had spent my career, here I, fell in love with Old Lyme and Lyme, and it's really part of my ancestry. And so it's just a kind of full circle story.
That is a great story. I really appreciate you guys coming to talk with us today. And,
well, my pleasure.
What a
Anytime.
great, interesting career you've had, and thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Edie.
Thank you.
A pleasure.